Italy sits in the middle of the Mediterranean Sea like a boot kicking into the water, and for thousands of years it has been one of the busiest crossroads on the entire planet. Armies marched through it. Traders sailed around it. Empires rose out of it, and empires eventually collapsed right on top of it. And for just as long, historians have told a fairly simple, comforting story about who the Italian people actually are. Descendants of ancient tribes, descendants of Rome itself. A people rooted deeply and cleanly in the exact same land they still live on today, generation after generation, stretching back into the mists of prehistory. Then scientists began pulling DNA directly out of old buried bones, and that simple, comforting story started to fall apart piece by piece. What ancient DNA revealed about the Italian peninsula did not just add a small footnote to the history books, it rewrote entire chapters of the story from the ground up. The ancestors of modern Italians turn out to be a mixture so complicated, so deeply layered, and so genuinely surprising that it makes the traditional tidy story look almost like a comforting myth, invented to make history feel simpler than it ever actually was. The DNA does not just complicate the question of where Italians originally came from. It shows, in exhaustive detail, that Italy was being remade again and again by wave after wave of people arriving from every possible direction, long before anyone had ever even heard the word Roman. To fully understand what the genetics ultimately overturned, you first need to understand the story that most people believed for a very, very long time. For centuries, the accepted picture of Italian identity was built almost entirely on written history and traditional archaeology. Rome, according to the standard story, grew slowly out of small tribal settlements scattered along the banks of the Tiber River, tribes that were supposedly already living in central Italy for a very long time before the city itself was ever formally founded. From there, according to the traditional account passed down through generations of historians, an unbroken thread of population and shared culture supposedly ran continuously forward in time. From the earliest Latin tribes, through the Roman Republic, through the height of the Roman Empire, and eventually all the way into the medieval and modern populations who call Italy home today. It was a tidy, satisfying story. Ancient roots stretching back into the deep past, a shared homeland, a people who had, more or less, always simply been there, unchanged and continuous. But there were always small cracks in that story, even long before DNA testing became scientifically possible. Italy sits directly at the crossing point of 3 separate continents. Africa is close enough to reach by a relatively short boat journey. The eastern Mediterranean naturally funnels people in from Greece, from Anatolia, and from the wider Near East. Central Europe presses steadily down from the north through the mountain passes of the Alps. Anyone looking honestly and carefully at a map could see that a place this exposed, this central, this easy to reach by both land and sea, was extremely unlikely to have somehow stayed genetically isolated and untouched for thousands upon thousands of years. And there were older historical mysteries too, mysteries that never fully went away no matter how many times historians and archaeologists attempted to explain them convincingly. The most famous of these lingering mysteries involves the Etruscans, a sophisticated civilization that thrived across central Italy long before Rome ever became a major power, a civilization with a written language that does not clearly relate to any other known language family in Europe, along with burial customs, artistic traditions, and religious practices that look strikingly different from those of their closest neighbors. Even ancient writers themselves were deeply confused about where exactly the Etruscans had originally come from. The Greek historian Herodotus wrote confidently that they had migrated from Anatolia in what is now modern-day Turkey. Other ancient writers insisted with equal confidence that the Etruscans were entirely native to Italy and had always lived there since the beginning. For well over 2,000 years, nobody could definitively settle this particular argument one way or the other. Archaeology alone could not fully answer the question. Language alone could not fully answer the question either. Only biology would eventually be able to answer it properly, and biology desperately needed ancient DNA technology to finally speak clearly. Then there is the much larger story of Rome itself. At the absolute height of its power, the Roman Empire stretched all the way from Britain in the far north to Egypt in the south, and from Spain in the west to Syria in the east. Millions upon millions of people moved through that sprawling empire over the centuries, as soldiers, as enslaved people, as merchants, as government officials, and as new settlers. Rome pulled in people from every single province it controlled anywhere across 3 continents and funneled enormous numbers of them directly back to the Italian peninsula, especially into the city of Rome itself, which at its absolute peak may have held close to 1 million residents, drawn from literally every corner of the known ancient world at that time. Historians had always strongly suspected that this constant influx of people had to have left some kind of noticeable genetic mark on the population. But simply suspecting something to be true and actually proving it with hard, concrete biological evidence are 2 very different things entirely. For a very long time, The only tools genuinely available to researchers studying Italian origins were traditional archaeology, incomplete written history, and careful studies of the DNA belonging to people living today. Each of these individual tools certainly had real scientific value, but none of them alone could ever fully settle the ongoing argument. Archaeology can show you physical objects, pottery fragments, ancient buildings, and old burial tombs, but objects do not always move together with the exact same people who originally made them, and new ideas can spread widely through simple trade contact, without any actual physical movement of population at all. Written history, meanwhile, is frequently biased, often incomplete, or simply missing entirely for the exact historical periods that matter the most to researchers. And studying the DNA of living people today, while genuinely useful in many ways, is a little bit like trying to read one specific old book after several hundred additional chapters have already been written directly on top of the original pages. Modern Italian DNA carries within it the deeply layered signal of thousands of years of complicated history, all mixed together at once and successfully untangling exactly which specific wave of ancient migration contributed, which specific genetic signal became incredibly difficult without something solid and ancient to directly compare it against. That crucial comparison point finally arrived once scientists learned how to properly extract and accurately read DNA directly from ancient human skeletons. This single technological breakthrough changed absolutely everything about how this history could be studied. Researchers could now travel directly to burial sites scattered widely across the entire Italian peninsula, ranging from the very earliest farming communities that existed thousands of years before Rome, all the way through the Bronze Age, through the Iron Age, through the full height of the Roman Empire itself, and continuing onward into the medieval period that followed, and successfully pull actual usable genetic material directly out of the ancient bones themselves. For the very first time in history, scientists were no longer simply looking at one single, blurry composite image, representing everything that had ever happened all mixed together. They were now looking at direct, individual snapshots of specific human beings who had lived at very specific moments in time, thousands of years apart. And what these individual snapshots ultimately revealed turned out to be far more dramatic and far more surprising than almost anyone studying the subject had originally expected. The very first major surprise came from deep within prehistory, long before anything even remotely resembling Rome ever existed on the peninsula. The earliest known inhabitants of the Italian peninsula, dating back to the period right after the last ice age finally ended, were hunter-gatherer peoples with a genetic profile that was noticeably quite different from the populations who followed them many centuries later. Then, starting roughly 8,000 years ago, an entirely new wave of farmers began arriving in Italy from across the eastern Mediterranean, successfully bringing organized agriculture with them, directly from the region of modern-day Turkey and the wider Near East. This was not simply a useful new idea, slowly spreading naturally from one village to the next over time. The DNA evidence clearly shows an actual physical population moving directly in and largely replacing, or at the very least, heavily mixing and interbreeding with, the hunter-gatherer populations who had originally lived there long before them. Organized farming did not simply arrive in Italy on its own as an idea. Actual farmers themselves physically arrived in Italy, bringing their entire way of life along with them. Then came yet another significant wave, arriving many thousands of years later, this time flowing steadily down from the vast open grasslands of the Eurasian steppe, representing the exact same enormous demographic wave of steppe-related ancestry that dramatically transformed the entire genetic landscape of nearly all of Europe during the Bronze Age period. People carrying this distinctive steppe-related ancestry moved directly into Italy and thoroughly mixed with the established farming populations already living there. And this particular genetic mixture eventually became the biological foundation for the populations who would go on to build the sophisticated Iron Age cultures of the peninsula, including, quite eventually, the very earliest Romans themselves. So even before we get anywhere close to the actual founding of Rome as a city, the Italian peninsula had already been thoroughly shaped by at least 3 completely separate major waves of migration and genetic mixture. Hunter-gatherers first, then farmers arriving directly from the Near East, and finally, steppe-related populations arriving from the north and east. The comforting idea of one single, pure, ancient Italian population, sitting completely untouched in one fixed place since the very dawn of time, was already looking extremely shaky and questionable long before Rome had even been formally founded as a settlement. And then, finally, came the long-standing Etruscan question, the exact mystery that had genuinely puzzled historians for well over 2,000 consecutive years. When researchers finally managed to successfully extract and carefully analyze ancient DNA taken directly from Etruscan burial sites, the results genuinely surprised almost everyone involved in the research, though probably not in the exact way either side of that ancient 2,000-year-old argument had originally expected. The genetic ancestry of the Etruscan people turned out to closely and clearly match the genetic ancestry of their neighboring Latin-speaking populations. the very same populations who would eventually go on to build the city of Rome itself. In other words, the Etruscans were not, in fact, some mysterious foreign population who had sailed in from distant Anatolia and settled down quietly as complete strangers among the local population, exactly as Herodotus had confidently claimed all those centuries earlier. Genetically speaking, they looked essentially identical to everyone else already living across central Italy at that particular point in time. But here's precisely where this discovery gets truly interesting, and where that old 2,000-year-old argument turns out to have completely missed the real point all along. The Etruscans were genetically very similar to their immediate neighbors, and yet their unique language, their distinct religious practices, and much of their broader culture remained strikingly and stubbornly different. What this fascinating discovery tells researchers is that language and culture do not always necessarily travel together directly alongside large-scale population movements. A specific group of people can share almost completely identical ancestry with their closest neighbors and still somehow develop, or inherit, or carefully preserve a completely distinct language and cultural identity of their own. The long-standing Etruscan mystery was never really a mystery about where a population had physically originated from in a geographic sense. It was actually a much deeper mystery about how culture and language can diverge sharply and completely from underlying biology, something that the ancient world simply had no proper framework to understand at the time, and something that modern historians ended up spending 2,000 years trying to force awkwardly into the wrong kind of explanation entirely. If the Etruscan discovery successfully reshaped one small corner of Italian history, what happened next ended up reshaping nearly the entire historical picture all at once, because the single biggest transformation of all took place directly during the absolute height of the Roman Empire itself. When researchers carefully studied ancient DNA extracted from burial sites located in and directly around the city of Rome, spanning the entire period from the founding of the city through the full imperial era and well beyond, they uncovered something genuinely remarkable. During the absolute height of Roman imperial power, the overall genetic makeup of the population actually living within the city of Rome shifted quite dramatically. Ancestry linked directly to the eastern Mediterranean, to the wider Near East, and to the region around modern-day Turkey, Syria, Lebanon, and Greece became genuinely dominant among the specific people buried in and around the city during this period. This was not simply some small, gradual trickle of new arrivals, slowly blending in quietly at the edges of society. This represented a genuinely massive demographic transformation, one that lines up almost perfectly with everything historians already firmly understood about the sheer scale of Roman trade networks, widespread mass slavery, large-scale forced resettlement programs, extensive military recruitment drawn from conquered provinces, and the sheer overwhelming gravitational pull that the city of Rome itself exerted across the entire ancient Mediterranean world. Really stop and think carefully about what this actually means in practice. At the absolute height of its power, the population actually living within the very capital city of the Roman Empire itself, the same city that gave Latin culture both its name and its central hub, was overwhelmingly shaped by ancestry, originating from the very eastern provinces that the empire itself had conquered. Rome did not simply rule distantly over a diverse and sprawling empire from some comfortable distance away. Rome, the physical city itself, became genuinely and thoroughly transformed genetically by that very same empire, directly absorbing enormous numbers of people originating from the very lands it had conquered and controlled. And then, just as dramatically as before, the entire story shifts once again. After the eventual fall of the Western Roman Empire, as the massive imperial system that had originally been pulling people steadily toward the city finally collapsed completely, the genetic makeup of the population living in and around Rome shifted noticeably once more. Ancestry linked directly to Central and Northern Europe became considerably more prominent during this period, lining up very closely with the established historical record of Germanic and other northern populations, steadily moving into Italy during the chaotic centuries that followed Rome's eventual collapse. The very same city that had been thoroughly reshaped by the East during the height of empire was subsequently reshaped again by the North during the long, difficult centuries of its eventual decline. What all of this evidence reveals, laid out plainly and honestly, is that the overall population of Italy, and especially the specific population of the city of Rome itself, was never actually a fixed, stable, unchanging thing quietly sitting still throughout history. It was constantly, continuously being remade over and over again, farmers arriving directly from the Near East, thousands of years before Rome ever existed, steppe populations arriving from the east and north during the Bronze Age period. A massive, dramatic influx of Eastern Mediterranean ancestry during the height of imperial power. A significant, noticeable wave of Northern and Central European ancestry following the empire's eventual collapse. Layers stacked carefully upon layer, with each individual wave leaving its own permanent mark on the DNA of the generations who came directly after it. The old, simple, comforting story, an unbroken thread running cleanly and continuously from ancient tribes through Rome and directly into modern Italians today, simply does not survive honest contact with the actual genetic evidence now available. What survives instead is something far messier, and honestly, something far more genuinely interesting. Modern Italian ancestry is not one single clean thread. It is more like a thick rope made up of many different individual threads, twisted tightly together over thousands of years, with each separate thread contributed by a different wave of people arriving from a different direction at a different specific point in history. The genetics also reveal something fascinating about the sheer diversity that existed within Italy at any single given moment in time, not merely spread out across the centuries, but even within individual single generations. Careful studies of burial sites dating from the Roman imperial period clearly show that even within single individual cemeteries, from the exact same time period, in the exact same city, individual people buried there could carry wildly different ancestral backgrounds from one another. Someone with ancestry, tracing back primarily to the Eastern Mediterranean, might be buried within just a few feet of someone else whose ancestry traced back primarily to North Africa, who might in turn be buried close to someone whose ancestry pointed clearly toward Northern Europe instead. Rome, at the absolute height of its power, was not simply an empire that ruled distantly over diverse populations scattered across its many provinces. The city itself, sitting at the very center of that empire, was itself genuinely one of the most genetically diverse places found anywhere on the entire planet at that specific point in human history. This finding lines up perfectly with what historians already knew from written historical records, that Rome pulled in people from every single corner of its vast territory. But the DNA evidence gives that existing historical picture an entirely new level of concrete, individual, human detail that written records alone could simply never have fully provided on their own. There's also a quieter, considerably more personal layer buried within this larger story, one that comes specifically from studying not entire populations at once, but rather individual people one at a time. Researchers have successfully managed to trace, in genuinely remarkable and precise detail, the specific ancestral background of individual people buried in Roman-era cemeteries, sometimes even successfully identifying that one single specific person buried somewhere in Italy carried ancestry that traced directly back to a very specific and genuinely distant region of the ancient world, someone who was born far away and somehow ended up living, dying, and eventually being buried on the Italian peninsula instead. These findings are not simply abstract statistics sitting in a research paper somewhere. These represent individual human lives, real people, who were born in one distant part of the ancient world and ended up, whether through trade, through slavery, through military service, or through simple personal opportunity, living out the remainder of their lives in Italy instead. The DNA evidence effectively turns the somewhat abstract idea of Roman connectivity into something genuinely and startlingly personal and human. What this entire body of accumulated evidence ultimately reveals is not one single dramatic reversal, not one single clean moment where scientists definitively proved that Italians had actually come from somewhere else entirely. It is instead something considerably more layered and nuanced, and honestly, something far more true to how human history has always actually worked in reality. Italy was never truly a closed-off, isolated homeland populated continuously by one single unbroken ancestral line stretching back into deep prehistory. It was instead one of the most genuinely connected, most frequently and thoroughly remade places found anywhere on the entire planet. A single peninsula that successfully pulled in farmers from the Near East, herders from the distant steppe, traders and enslaved people and soldiers from every single province of an empire that spanned across 3 entire continents, and later on, additional populations moving steadily south from the collapsing northern edges of that very same empire's crumbling frontier. The Etruscans, once widely thought to be foreign outsiders who had arrived from distant lands, turn out instead to have been genetically almost completely identical to their immediate neighbors, serving as a powerful reminder that language and culture can sometimes diverge quite sharply from underlying biology. The city of Rome itself, once commonly imagined as the pure, unchanging heart of a distinctly Italian civilization, turns out instead to have been genetically transformed not just once, but multiple separate times, by the very same empire that it originally built and controlled. And the modern population of Italy today carries within it the layered biological evidence of every single one of these historic transformations, folded quietly and invisibly into DNA that most ordinary people walking around today have simply never had any real reason to examine closely. None of this remarkable evidence diminishes what the Roman world actually managed to build over the centuries. If anything, it makes that historic achievement considerably more remarkable, not less impressive at all. An empire that successfully managed to pull people together from as far as Britain to Egypt, and from Spain all the way to Syria, and that left its permanent genetic fingerprint not merely on some distant outlying province, but directly on the very city, sitting at its own central heart, was not simply ruling distantly over a diverse world from some comfortable detached distance. It was, at its very core, a living, breathing product of that same diversity. The city of Rome was never simply the empire's administrative capital. It was, quite literally, made directly out of the empire itself, one migration at a time, one marriage at a time, one buried skeleton at a time. And remarkably, this particular story is still not entirely finished being told. Ancient DNA research focused on the Italian peninsula continues actively today, with new burial sites constantly being studied, new historical time periods being carefully examined, and new fascinating details being steadily added to a picture that keeps growing more complicated with every single new set of ancient bones that scientists manage to successfully analyze. What originally began as a fairly simple, comforting story about one ancient people rooted cleanly and permanently in one single place has gradually become something much closer to the actual truth of how most places on Earth genuinely came to be populated in reality, through wave after wave of arrival, mixture, and constant change, stretching back for far longer than anyone had ever originally assumed possible. The old comforting idea of one single ancient, unbroken Italian bloodline running cleanly and continuously from the earliest tribes all the way through Rome and directly into the present day simply does not hold up when honestly tested against the hard evidence buried deep within the bones themselves. What the DNA reveals instead is a single peninsula shaped again and again by people arriving steadily from the east, from the north, and from across the open sea, with each individual wave leaving something permanent behind, each new layer folding directly into the next one, until the people living across Italy today carry within their own bodies a genetic record representing nearly the entire ancient world at once. The ancient ruins are still standing proudly across Italy today. The broken stone columns, the old weathered city walls, the massive amphitheaters where huge crowds once gathered together from every single corner of an empire that stretched confidently across 3 entire continents. For centuries, those same ancient ruins were read and interpreted as monuments built specifically to honor one singular, distinctly Italian civilization, built by one unified people for that same one people, rooted firmly in one unbroken line, stretching back continuously into the deep and distant past. The DNA evidence tells a genuinely different story instead, and in many important ways, a far more remarkable and inspiring one. It tells the true story of a peninsula that became truly great, not because it somehow stayed exactly the same throughout history, but precisely because it never once stopped changing, constantly absorbing wave after wave of new people, new ancestry, and new blood, until the very comforting idea of one single pure Italian origin finally dissolves quietly away into what the actual science now clearly shows us. A rich and complicated story written not by one single people alone, but by many different peoples together, arriving from every possible direction, meeting together on one single peninsula, and becoming, together as one, something entirely and remarkably new.